So the bony surface anatomy for the radial side of the wrist and thumb, we're going to first place his wrist in a maximal loose pack position. So I'm just going to roll this up a little bit. So slight flexion, slight ulnar deviation. We're going to start with first identifying the proximal border, and how we're going to do that is we're going to first find our radial styloid. We're going to go distal to proximal, coming up until I feel I can't go any further. I ask him to radially and ulnarly deviate his wrist. It should not move, so that I know I'm at the radial styloid. So I come in and I'm going to mark that here. And now he's just going to relax. I'm going to come in and I'm going to go distal to proximal as I outline. Here, I'm going to bring this up just a little more. There we go. Here. And it's easier to come from distal to proximal when you're palpating the distal border of the radius, because there's a lot of different prominences here. If you go proximal to distal, sometimes you get lost. So it's easier to go distal to proximal. Coming in, and we're going to go up to where we feel it's going to meet the ulna. And now what I want to do is I'm going to find the distal radial ulnar joint line. So I'm going to have him just extend a small finger for me here. The extensor digiti minimi comes along that distal radial ulnar joint line. So right here. Perfect. Good. Okay. Now we've identified here on the radial side the proximal border of the carpus. Now we're going to find our distal border. So what we're going to do is we're going to come in and we are going to ultimately identify the base of the second and third, but it's easier to start with the fourth because sometimes people have carpal bosses where you have either soft tissue or bony enlargement at the CMC joint. So we're going to start with the fourth. We're going to go distal to proximal until I feel a little divot here, and that is my CMC joint line. So I'm going to follow this down here. He's got a little bit of a carpal boss here and here. When I identify for the thumb, I'm going to come in, and this is going to look more proximal because we remember the thumb is rotated 45 degrees. So now we're going to join that line. So we've identified now the distal border of our carpus. Okay, perfect. Now we're going to find our V notches. So we're going to come in here, and we're going to go in between our second and third metacarpal. We're going to follow that down until it can't go any further, and we're going to mark that V. So we're going to be identifying the width of the base of our metacarpals because we're going to use those to help us to find our carpal bones. We're going to find that the first web space has a larger V because of that rotation of the metacarpal. And we're going to drop that line down here. Okay. And now we can draw out here, if we come along the radial and ulnar aspects of the shaft of our third metacarpal, and we're going to do the same for our second. Now, our second metacarpal is going to look quite wide because we're looking at it from a dorsal and a radial view. So here, coming in, so there's our second metacarpal. And now I'm going to identify the first. So I come in here and follow that down. Good. Okay, so now we're going to do our arbitrary lines. So if we take this area, we're going to split this up into 3 equal sections. So we're not going to palpate anything. We're just going to put some dotted lines here. So we have 3 equal-sized rectangular boxes. Okay. Then we're going to come in and we're going to find our capitate. So our capitate is slightly wider than the width of the base of our third metacarpal, and it's going to, because it's such a large bone, it's going to take up the distal 2/3 here of this compartment. So this is all capitate here. Good, and that's that divot that we feel in our wrist. We know, hey, we're in the right spot. This is the capitate. Okay, now we're going to find our trapezoid. Our trapezoid is going to be the width of the base of our second metacarpal, but it's a much smaller bone, so we're just going to come in and we're just going to use that distal box right here. That's our trapezoid. Then we're going to find our scaphoid. And our scaphoid as we recall, is going to sit in 30 to 60 degrees of flexion. It's going to look massive from this position because we're looking at it two-dimensionally for this three-dimensional structure. So it rests in a flexed position here. We're going to find the scaphoid is going to come along the radial half of the distance between the capitate and distal radius. Here, coming in. All of this is scaphoid. So if we picture that scaphoid being in a flexed position, and we look at the dorsal compartment of the wrist, all of this is scaphoid. When we look on the radial side, too, the proximal two boxes are also going to be the scaphoid. Here. And now we're going to find our trapezium. And our trapezium, in a maximal loose pack position as he's sitting, the base of my first metacarpal is going to cover up the trapezium, so we can't palpate it. But if I have him bring his thumb across and hold that here, now I can palpate the trapezium. And sometimes it's really tender on people, so you got to be careful with that. So here's our trapezium. Go ahead and relax. If I have him come up and I have him extend his EPL, that EPL should land between the trapezoid and trapezium. So pretty good. Good, and relax. Now we're going to go on the volar side of the wrist. So I'm going to have him turn here. And we're going to find the scaphoid now from the volar side. We remember the scaphoid's resting in a flexed position. So we've identified the proximal pole. Now the distal pole, how we're going to find that, we think about the mechanics. When we go from ulnar deviation to radial deviation, the scaphoid has to flex so that it doesn't run into the radial styloid. So I'm going to place my finger just distal to that wrist crease, and I'm going to radially deviate his wrist, and I'm going to feel the scaphoid tubercle is going to become prominent. So that is what we're palpating, is the distal pole of the scaphoid. What rests just distal to the scaphoid tubercle is the trapezium tubercle, and I think of the two as a mountain. The proximal aspect is scaphoid tubercle, the distal is the trapezium tubercle. So I'm going to mark here the scaphoid. When I ulnarly deviate, I'm going just distal to the scaphoid. Now the scaphoid is extending out of the way, and now I should be able to palpate the trapezium tubercle right here. Okay. Our final structure on the radial side of the wrist is going to be our trapezoid, and that's going to be important, especially when we're performing our radial column techniques. So the trapezoid, because of the thick soft tissue in the palm, we can't palpate it on the volar side, so we're going to extrapolate. We know that it's going to be just ulnar to our trapezium tubercle, and we're going to find that by looking dorsally. Here is my trapezoid. So on the volar side here, we have our trapezoid, trapezium, and scaphoid. Scaphoid most prominent with radial deviation, trapezium tubercle most prominent with ulnar deviation. So now that we have the bony anatomy, we're going to go through and identify the soft tissue. So we're going to use red for that. So we're going to come in first and identify the first dorsal compartment. So if I ask him to radially deviate his thumb, and just hold that for me, here's where I'm going to find that first dorsal compartment. So that consists of the abductor pollicis longus and the extensor pollicis brevis here. Now, sometimes you can palpate a nice V. We see the APL is going to insert into the base of the first metacarpal, and the extensor pollicis brevis is going to continue on up into the thumb, and it's going to be responsible for extending at the thumb MP joint here. And I can palpate a little bit that little V notch here. Good. So that's our first dorsal compartment. The second dorsal compartment, I'm going to have him make a fist and come up. Hold that. Here we're going to see our extensor carpi radialis, longus, and brevis. Here and here. So they travel together. The longus is going to come up, and it's going to attach at the base of our second metacarpal here. And our brevis is going to come in and attach to the base of our third metacarpal here. So that's our second dorsal compartment. Go ahead and relax. And then I'm going to ask him to perform thumb retro position. So now we have our EPL. Our EPL is going to wrap around Lister's tubercle, which I'm going to palpate right here, coming around, and I can trace that out. The EPL is the only tendon responsible for hyperextension at the IP joint, because we know our intrinsic muscles can extend to neutral, but only the EPL can hyperextend. Good, and relax. So on the dorsal compartment side, we have our first dorsal compartment of APL and EPB. The second dorsal compartment, we have extensor carpi radialis longus and brevis. And the third dorsal compartment, if I have him extend, I have my extensor pollicis longus. Now we're going to switch, and we just have one structure to identify on the volar side, and that's the flexor carpi radialis. So I'm going to have him come in. I want his fingers straight here. Come in and hold that for me. So here we can see his palmaris, just radial to that we have flexor carpi radialis. Coming in here. Now, it's going to go in through the transverse carpal ligament. It has its own little canal, and it's going to attach into the base of the second metacarpal here. So if you have an issue, go ahead and relax. The flexor carpi radialis insertional tendinopathy, we're going to be performing our transverse friction here at the base of our second metacarpal. If we have a tenosynovitis, we need to come in proximal to the transverse carpal ligament because we can't access that through the transverse carpal ligament. We've got to go just proximal, and here's where we perform our friction. So just one tendon that we have to look at on the volar aspect on the radial side, and then we have 3 on the dorsal side.